Great. It's recording now, and I think, can you see me, everyone?
Yeah.
Great. So today's session is going to be a bit different from what we have already done before, because we're going to go deep into some of the mental pathology, mental disorders that you may have a rough idea of how it works, but what we'll try to do today is go deep into it, the research, and find out why it happens, what it is, and what are the symptoms, and we can discuss what are the cure in the Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so this is the Golden State Killer who was responsible for 50 rapes, around 100 burglaries, and 13 murders in the year 70s to 80s. He was uncaught for around, he was only caught in 2018. So he had this modus operandi where he would stay at the victim's house for hours and would blindfold them, and just as they would start thinking that he has left, he would jump in and scare them away, and often he would call them years after the incident, scaring them. In one of the calls, he'd said to one of his victims that I'm going to kill you, and he started breathing heavily through the phone call. Now, this is the classic example of a psychopath. And we already know, we've already, fascinated by psychopaths thanks to Netflix documentaries and stuff. Whether it's Hannibal Lecter, The Silence of the Lambs, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein. So what we need to understand, what we need to discuss, what we're going to discuss today is what exactly is a psychopath, and why someone becomes a psychopath. So we'll go deeply into that in the next slide. Anirudh, next slide. Okay. So a psychopath is someone who has a personality disorder. Psychopaths generally have an antisocial personality disorder. And personality disorders are not the same as mental disorders, because personality disorders usually last for a lifetime. They last for your entire life, while mental disorders are often curable and go away. So there are around 10 types of personality disorders: schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, avoidant obsessive compulsive personality disorder. But we'll be discussing only one type of personality disorder in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Personality for Mental Disorders, where all of the diseases, all of the mental disorders are characterized. Personality disorders are essentially characterized into three clusters. Cluster A is the insane part, where a person experiences hallucinations and stuff. Cluster C is the anxiety part, depression and that sort of personality disorders related to that. We'll be discussing three personality disorders from cluster B. And in cluster B, there are 4 personality disorders. The one that I will not be discussing is histrionic personality disorder. It's essentially attention-seeking behavior. So we'll be discussing antisocial personality disorder in the next slide. So antisocial personality disorder, essentially, there is no diagnosis of a psychopath. A psychopath, there is no one in the DSM, you will not find something saying, this is what psychopathy means. The psychopaths are usually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. This does not mean that everyone who has antisocial personality disorder is a psychopath or a sociopath, but everyone who is a psychopath has antisocial personality disorder, which is characterized by lack of empathy And we'll discuss more about what empathy really means in the next few slides. Manipulation, psychopaths are very adept at manipulating people. They do not feel any remorse. They will treat you essentially as a means to an end. So they have no remorse. They will lie to you all the time. They will cheat on you. They will not treat you as a sort of a person. And what that really means, it does not mean, because we assume that treating someone as an object means essentially committing crimes or murdering people. Yes, that is the extreme end of it. But when I say that they treat people as a means to an end, what I'm essentially meaning is that they're going to, they may act good with you. They may pretend like they care about you or they love you. But as soon as you give them what they want, they're going to go away and they're going to leave. So you are useful. So as soon as you're useful to them, they will stay with you. And when you're not useful, they will discard you. So that is one of the major characteristics of a psychopath. Pathological lying also means that they do not feel any anxiety when they lie to you. So psychopaths easily pass these polygraph tests. Now, when a normal person lies, we are usually, there's a sense of anxiety in us, there's a sense of physiological responses which are caught by the polygraph dictator. But for a psychopath, the distinction between truth and lie is not really that important, because as long as the lie serves them, as long as the lie is useful to them, they will do it and they will feel absolutely no remorse for it. Impulsivity, psychopaths, people with antisocial personality disorder, not necessarily psychopaths. Impulsivity is essentially the failure to plan ahead. That is, when people with antisocial personality disorder get angry, they will react violently to you, they will physically abuse you, and they cannot control their emotions. Shallow effect, which is lack of emotion. So when a family member of a person with ASPD dies, the person in question will not cry, he will not, and I'm using he because people who have ASPD are usually him, it's usually men. So shallow effect is essentially when if a person dies in your family, you do not feel any remorse for them. You do not feel the slightest bit of guilt or shame or sadness. Grandiose self-worth. People with ASPD are notorious for their self-worth, which is, in all of these, at least two of these cluster B personality disorders, you'll find grandiose self-worth as one of the essential frames. So in the next slide, we're going to discuss what empathy actually means. So the clinical psychologist Simon Baron Cohen defines empathy as a distinction between single-minded thinking and double-minded thinking. So when you are single-mindedly thinking, you're essentially only thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about how your actions are going to affect others. When you're thinking double-minded, thinking is essentially when you think about others as well as yourself. So it does, like, it's the ego part of you, super ego part of you, which tells you what you should do and what you shouldn't, which tells you to control your impulses, your passion. So double-minded thinking is something that say you have this urge to be violent, you have this urge to hurt someone. Double-minded thinking would tell you, don't do that, stop, because that other person will not feel good if you do that. And that is essentially double-minded thinking. So someone who lacks empathy is likely to have a single-minded thinking. Now, the philosopher Martin Buber distinguishes this between ich, du versus ich, es, which is I, you versus I, it distinction. And that essentially means, what I said before about treating people as an object. Now, when I treat you as it, that means that I'm treating you as an object, not as a person. You is when I treat you as a person, as a end in itself, and not as a means to my end. So there are labels of empathy. Baron Cohen talks about these levels of empathy, essentially 6 levels of empathy. Level 0 is where the cluster B disorder lies, level 0 and level 1, which includes borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Level 0 and 1 is the time when you are extremely violent, you're likely to hurt people, you will be manipulative, you will have no empathy towards people. And level 2 and level 3 is when a person will essentially have low empathy, but he will recognize that the low empathy, is harms people. He will have problem reading faces. He will have problem telling whether a person is happy or sad. He will not know how to react when a person is sad or when a person opens up. So people with level 3 essentially will stay silent, and they will not talk much because they don't get the social cues that we normally get. So but they're going to function well. That is, they're not going to be violent, they're not going to commit as much of antisocial acts as, say, someone with level 0 and level 1. Level 4 is where most men are. That is, at level 4, people bond over things instead of emotions. So you form your friendship because you have a co-worker, you're someone working with you. So that's why you form your friendship, because of that. Or you form your friendship because a person is likes the same fields that you do. Says he likes chess or he likes the sport that you do. So you bond, essentially you bond over things and fields instead of emotions. And this is essentially average empathy. And that's why men tend to read more nonfiction than women, right? So level 4 and level 5 is where more women are at than men. Level 4 is when someone has above average empathy. Someone is bonds. Level 4 is when someone bonds over emotions instead of things. Say you have friends because they share the same experiences as you do, or they've been vulnerable to you, or they went through a traumatic past and you're trying to help them get out of it. Or they're in a marriage and you share emotions. So that's essentially level 4, where you form friendships because of emotions. uh, Level 5. Level 6 is above average empathy, and these people can just read you by looking at you. They can make you feel so comfortable that you just sit at them, and they're going to tell you whether you're happy or sad, and they're going to ask you whether you're happy or sad, and before you realize, you're opening up to them in a way that you haven't before. So they tend to be high in interpersonal intelligence. Next slide. So this is the empathy circuit. So to understand why people commit the evil that they do, we need to understand a bit of biology, because a lot of these crimes are committed because of genetic reasons. As we'll see more as we go on, we'll see whether the influence of genetics and environment. We'll discuss more of that in detail. But to make it simpler, I'm not going to discuss all the 10 parts that are part of the empathy circuit, which are crucial to us having empathy. I'm only going to discuss the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And the best way to do that is to give you an example. And the example is in next slide, I think. Um, Okay, so this is one of the most famous uh, cases in medical history. So Phineas Gage was a worker living in the 1800s, 1890s or 70s. Don't remember the exact date. So he went to an accident where a rod went right through the side of his head and paralyzed his stop the functioning essentially of his left side face. As you can see, there's a description of how the rod went and where it actually went. So Phineas Gage lived a normal life after that incident. He miraculously survived, and he not talked, he walked, everything that he did. There was no difference in his accents or in his uh, behavior, except for one thing. His Phineas Gage used to be a very polite, a very empathetic person. But after the accident, he suddenly turned cold. He was uninterested in people. He would often be rude. He would be arrogant. He would not be understanding. So he lost his politeness after the incident. So what we have found, what scientists have found, is that it happened because the medial prefrontal cortex of his brain was damaged, which is responsible for politeness, for empathy. And you can see that the picture of the skull that you can see, it's his actual broken skull in Harvard Medical School. So you can see how it damaged his brain and the whole. Next slide. Okay, so when we talk about zero negative empathy, that is zero level of empathy, we're essentially talking about three personality disorders, as I mentioned before, which is psychopaths, that is antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Now, psychopaths and narcissistic personality disorder, I think most of you have an idea what it actually is, and we'll discuss more about it anyway. But borderline personality disorder, I think, is very important and very crucial. And I think most people do not know much about it, but which is why I'm really excited to discuss that with you. Next slide. Okay, so to be diagnosed as someone with antisocial personality disorder, or with someone as a psychopath or a sociopath, you must have something called conduct disorder. Now, children are not diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. You have to be at least 18 years old to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Um, so one of the criteria for diagnosing someone with that is if a person has conduct disorder. And conduct disorder is essentially antisocial acts when you're a juvenile. It's similar to juvenile delinquency. People with conduct disorder, children, uh, because it's always children. Children with conduct disorder will commit violent acts. Will suit up schools, for instance, will steal, will be reckless, will be victims of, you will use substance abuse, will take drugs, will perform bad in school. So those are the standard symptoms of someone with conduct disorder. Now, in conduct disorders, there's a distinction that is made between callous unemotional traits, someone who's high in callous unemotional traits, and someone who's low in callous unemotional traits. And this will tie into the sociopath psychopath distinction. Now, the callous unemotional traits, like you can see, is lack of remorse, lack of empathy, shallow affect, manipulation, disregard for punishment. Psychopaths is they don't care about punishment, which is why they don't feel afraid, or they're usually cool in prison, and they adapt very easily. They're like chameleons. Grandiosity. So these are the callous unemotional traits, and which are essential for someone who has someone who is a psychopath. Now, next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. So to make it easy for you, what these researchers did is they researched through identical twins, because if you want to find whether genes play a role or whether environment play a role, what you do in science essentially is you find out do an experiment of monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, which is identical twins and sweat twins. Identical twins are essentially very similar to each other, and they're they're essentially genetical clones of each other. They like the same kind of music, they wear the same kind of dress, they look similar, they act similar. Even if you separate them from their parents, if they're separated at birth, they will still be similar. So that is identical twins, where genes override the influence of environment, and monozygotic twins or fraternal twins is essentially non-identical twins is essentially they're siblings, just born at the same time, and they are not necessarily similar to each other. Now, these researchers did an experiment of people who with conduct disorder who had identical, and they compared identical twins with normal twins. Now, what they did found is that those who were conduct disorder and were high in callous and emotional traits, they were likely to become psychopaths, and those are some diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And those who had low callous and emotional traits were not likely to become psychopaths. So I think the result is on the next slide. So to summarize this, psychopathy is extremely heritable. So a majority of psychopaths become psychopaths not because of any environmental disturbance, but because they're born that way. A majority of sociopaths, on the other hand, the distinction between psychopathy and sociopathy, in the simple way, is a sociopath. Sociopath is someone who is likely to be born, to be made. A psychopath is someone who's likely to be born. So imagine someone who grows up in a crime-ridden environment. He commits crimes. His father commits crimes. He's born in a mob, in an environment where there's a over preponderance of mobs. In that situation, it is likely that the person in question is a sociopath. Sociopaths are, if you can become a sociopath, say, if you are exposed to violence constantly on a daily basis, then at a certain point you will lose your empathy. You will become desensitized to it, essentially. So these people, even though they do have the same traits, the same attitudes as sociopaths, they're born and they're made. And so in that sense, there is some hope, let's say, that they can be reformed, but not with psychopaths. Psychopaths cannot be reformed at all. Next slide. Okay, so this is a better way to distinguish sociopathy and psychopathy, which is that you remember that I said that psychopaths are likely to be all people with antisocial personality disorder are not likely to be psychopaths. So how do you find out if someone with antisocial personality disorder is a psychopath? Now, there are two factors essentially which characterize psychopathy, which is the interpersonal affective and the social deviance. Now, when it comes to psychopathy, the interpersonal or affective part is more present, which is charm, lying, lack of remorse. And that is not as present in, say, antisocial personality disorders. The social deviance part takes over. But when it comes to psychopath, the interpersonal part takes over, which is that you will often encounter sociopaths who are not very sure of themselves, who care about their family, or who have some sliver of humanity in them, some sliver of hope. Next slide. Okay, so narcissistic personality disorder. This is very interesting because narcissistic personality, because this seems to be very prevalent, more prevalent than we think of. Now, we need to distinguish narcissistic personality disorder with narcissism. Now, we assume that a person is narcissism when a person starts, shows off and thinks very highly of himself and is. Can you please mute whoever joined? Okay, great. So narcissism is different from narcissistic personality disorder. People with narcissistic personality disorder are likely to have a grandiose sense of self-importance. It's all me, 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 me. I am the best. I don't deserve, the world is not kind to me. I'm the best and I deserve to win the Nobel Prize, and people do not recognize my brilliance. They require excessive admiration. So it's interesting because people with narcissistic personality disorder would often do charitable acts. They were often post pictures of themselves, giving charity to kids in Africa or something like that. Now, you might be wondering that this person, is doing charity, so this person is not a narcissist, but that is not the case because he's doing charity because his goal is to take admiration from you. So, if you want to distinguish someone who does charity for charity's sake and someone who does charity for because he is narcissist, because he's a narcissist, then you can distinguish that by seeing how the person in question behaves with someone who is in the group, who is loyal to them. Now, when it comes to the person that is being given, that he is being charitable towards, say the kids or the poor people, he will behave nicely because that gives him the admiration. But to someone in that, say, NGO, who is loyal to him, who walks in the NGO, he would be basically an asshole to them. So he would be contemptuous, he would be scream at them, he would not treat them well, he would not pay them well. So this is the sort of narcissist, the communal narcissist, as it were. And it's very interesting because the communal narcissist stays within the group, and it's very difficult to draw the lines in that sense. Narcissists have a sense of entitlement. That is, they think that they're entitled for greatness, they're entitled for privilege, they're entitled for things. They tend to be interpersonally exploitative. They're likely to cheat on you. People with narcissism are likely to cheat on you. They will feel a bit of remorse compared with the psychopaths. If a psychopath cheats on you, he's not going to feel remorse. He's not going to feel anything towards you because for him, you are an object. So your feelings don't matter to a psychopath. But a narcissist might have that sliver of guilt, but it's not enough to stop it. So that pattern, the cheating pattern, is going to continue no matter what you do. So they tend to be interpersonally exploitative in that sense. Also, they tend to be interpersonally exploitative in the business sense. That is, they do not feel bad if they have to put someone down in order to rise up the dominance hierarchy, or people like that. So narcissists are great at business, and a lot of successful businessmen that we have heard of are likely to be narcissistic, because narcissistic is rewarded. Narcissistic self-interest is rewarded when it comes to business. They lack empathy, obviously. They're arrogant, obviously, and envious. So a narcissistic personality disorder is often confused with depression. And you might be thinking that a narcissistic is supposed to have a high self-esteem, a grandiose sense of self-importance. How can a narcissist be misdiagnosed as someone with depression? And that brings us to the pathological narcissism. Now, pathological narcissism covers the grandiose sense of self-importance that NPD covers. It also covers the vulnerable part of narcissism. That is, a narcissistic personality, a person with narcissism is likely to be, to say that nobody understands me. The world is cruel to me. The world does not understand my importance. Everybody is cruel to me. So it's all going to be me. So that their sense of depression, as it were, or low self-esteem is going to revolve around themselves. And they feel bad not because they have done something wrong, but because the world does not recognize their greatness. And it can be very tricky at first, because you might be, lay people usually confuse pathology. Even psychiatrists and clinical psychologists often misdiagnose pathological narcissism with that of depression, because the outward symptoms might say the same. But someone who's depressed is likely to have a sense of self-awareness. That is, they're going to likely to blame themselves. A narcissistic a person with NPD will blame the world. So that is one of the main distinctions between the vulnerable narcissist, as it were, and the uh, depressed person. I have told the group before that a person with zero level of empathy, with low levels of empathy, is not likely to not care about others. It's not like if you have low levels of empathy, you don't care about others at all. And for that, we'll have to go to the next slide, the next personality disorder, which is borderline personality disorder. And this is very, very interesting and very, very important. This is one of the intriguing disorders that I have come across, and most people don't know much about borderline personality disorder. So people with borderline personality disorder are more likely to be women than men. They're likely to lack empathy, zero, that they're in the same sort of Venn diagram that we saw before. But that is going to manifest very, very differently than narcissism or psychopathy. That is, people with borderline personality disorder will feel real or perceived abandonment, which is that they're very unstable. So people with BPD, their relationships are usually extremely intense. And it usually starts out intense, but then it becomes sort of verbally or physically abusive, in the sense that they're always going to tell you that you're leaving them, because they always have this sense of that you're going to abandon them, that real or perceived abandonment. So they're going to tell you that you don't love them, you're cheating on them, and they don't have to have a good reason. It doesn't have to be logical, which is why the perceived abandonment part is there. So they're going to tell it to you anyway. So They're going to repeatedly tell you that you don't care about them, you don't love them, but at the next moment, within the next hour, they're going to act all clingy and tell you how much it matters, how much they matter to you, and how much they care about you, and how intense, and how you are the sort of ideal person, the idealized love. So they feel a sort of sense of emptiness, which is that we, all of us, have a strong sense of self. That self, there's obviously a sort of it differs from person to person, but we still have a firm sense of self. We'll know who we are. People with borderline personality disorder don't have that strong sense of self. They feel completely empty, and to fill up that emptiness inside of them, they usually, to manage that unstable sense of self, they usually look up or idealize a person. That is, this person is going to make me whole, is going to complete me, is going to give me a meaning. Or they would spend more money because they're going to fill up their emptiness with that money. They're going to spend more money than they have. They're going to compulsively go and do shopping. They're going to often change their names, which is because of that unstable identity. That is, they'll have one name, they'll like to be referred to with one name this week, another name next week, and they're likely to um, generally feel empty. And obviously the suicidal behavior act comes up. People with borderline personality disorder are very prone to suicide, and this is one of the most common symptoms. They're going to threaten you with suicide because they feel abandoned. They feel like you don't love them, even though you do, even though you have shown to them, whether you're a family member or a romantic partner, even though you have proved to them logically that you love them and you're not cheating, they still have this perceived abandonment. So they're going to threaten you with suicide. They're going to tell you that if you don't stay here, I'm going to commit suicide. So that sort of is an act to bring attention to themselves and sort of to ensure that you don't abandon them. So these people have a high rate of suicide attempt as well. Now those attempts are usually an attention seeking event. That is, it's not meant to be serious, but it's often at the, when it gets really, 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 really extreme, it gets serious. And those attempts, people are likely to commit suicide and succeed in that with borderline personality disorder. They have dissociative symptoms. Dissociative symptoms is rare in people with borderline personality disorder. It is essentially that because they have a low sense of self, a low sense of identity, because they don't know who they are. And when it gets really, really, really extreme, they're going to adopt another identity altogether, which is that they're going to adopt the identity of a 4-year-old child. They're going to adopt identity of someone someone with a different name, with a different interests, with a different behavior. So, which is why it's often confused with TID, which is dissociative identity disorder, in which people have multiple personalities, as it were. So the distinction between dissociative identity disorder and DID and borderline personality disorder, look, the lines are very blurry over here. That is, at first glance, you will not understand whether a person actually has borderline personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, which is why you have to be listening to them throughout the, for a very long time, period of time. Now, borderline personality disorder, unlike the other two disorder, thankfully, is something which can be managed. As with all personality disorder, it's not going to go away completely, but it can be managed, and people with borderline personality disorder desperately want to be helped. They need help and they want to be helped because they're suffering every second. It's not good for them or for people around them as well. So in that sense, borderline personality disorder, dialectical behavioral therapy is seen to be as something which is effective in this case. Um, but narcissists and psychopaths don't, they will, you cannot force them to take help. Even though they do take help, they're going to, manipulate you. They might act like they're recovering, or they're, not fantasizing about stuff. So, they don't have those traits anymore, but they're like chameleon, right? So they're very good at adapting to you. They're very good at lying, and they're very good at convincing you that they care, and that, they're not really the same person anymore. But at the end of the day, they're going to act in the same manner as soon as they're left out, because they're only going to act that way um, when it suits them. With people with narcissism, uh, they're not going to admit that they're narcissist at all. So they don't need any help because they have a grandiose sense of self-esteem, and I don't need any help. I am the best in the world, and you can only take them to a therapist or a psychologist when the help is external. Say they have a substance abuse disorder, say, and you take them to a psychiatrist to treat that uh, instead of their narcissism. So it's usually when they do seek help, it's usually when the world is cruel to them and not for the narcissistic part of it. So that is very, very hard to manage, and there is no known cure. There is no cure for BPD either, but it can be managed. Next slide. Okay, so now we have, I think, a very good idea of personality disorders. A rough idea, although we have only touched the surface level, and I'm just going very fast because we need to get soon to the question and answer session. Um, so depression is one of the most misunderstood uh, disorder that there is, and you can say that about every mental disorder. But depression has been so bastardized, and it's used so commonly in colloquial term that we often cannot distinguish between sadness and depression. For those of you who have read my article on mental health, I gave a scenario over there. Say someone, a student, let's say, a student gets a report card, and his report card, he sees that his grades are terrible, awful. So he becomes nervous. He's in the verge of tears. He's extremely sad. So that is sadness. But then the teacher says that, oh, well, that's not your report card. I gave you the wrong report card. And so the report card is taken away, and he's given it his report card, and his grades are good, and his face suddenly lights up. So in this case, sadness in question had an external factor, an external reason. And when that external factor was given away, the depression or the sadness, not the depression, the sadness was gone. But depressed people do not feel like that. It's not as easy to pin down external factors because often there is a strong genetic component to depression. So people with depression are going to feel like they don't matter, feeling of worthlessness and sadness and hopelessness and emptiness every single second of their life. And it's going to manifest outwards. It's characterized by anhedonia. It's a major symptom. Anhedonia is essentially when you stop doing the things that you love, the things that give you pleasure, as it were. Say, a musician who loves playing music suddenly doesn't play music anymore and doesn't like it. A writer who loves writing suddenly stops writing and doesn't get pleasure from it. Say you like um, eating good food and you suddenly don't enjoy it at all. And, pick out any of your interests and you do not like the things that you used to like. You're essentially cut off from it, and nothing gives you pleasure, nothing makes you sad. It's a feeling of numbness rather than sadness. It's wanting, it's not, depressed people do not want to feel happy as much as they want to not feel anything at all. So it's wanting to not feel. uh, it's the absent, what they want is the absence of what they feel rather than happiness itself. It's a sense of normalcy that they want. Weight loss or weight gain. Depressed people are likely to consume a lot of food because food which is high in dopamine, because in depression the dopaminergic pathways are essentially blocked due to stress. And so dopamine, which makes you happy, which keeps you which lights you up, is essentially absent in depression. There's a dopamine uh, is reduced. So to gain that, depressed people eat a lot, um, and that results in weight gain or weight loss, which is that they don't eat anything at all. And it's different from eating disorders, because in eating disorder you have a dysphoric body image, that is you don't like your body, and so you eat a lot and then you feel guilty and then you use laxatives and you purge it off. But that isn't really depressing. They eat because they because of the dopamine part of it, because they want more serotonin, and they just want to occupy themselves anyway. And when they don't eat anything at all, it's usually because, imagine you're in a jungle and nobody is there in that jungle, and a tiger comes up to you. So what you see in front of you is a tiger roaring, and he's looking at you, and you're just still over there. And your first thought at that movement will be to escape the tiger. It will not be to what am I going to eat, what sort of things, it's not going to, you're not going to play music over there. You're not going to so your body will not feel the normal response, normal hunger and everything. Even though you were hungry before you saw the tiger, you would not be hungry anymore because of the release of adrenaline. And this is how depressed people feel every second and every moment of their lives. Insomnia or hypersomnia is essentially when you don't sleep much, or you sleep too much. Um, Someone says drug abuse is also evident in depression. Yes, drug abuse is evident in depression. Drug abuse is not one of the symptoms of it. It's not one of the medical symptoms, but yeah, it's one of the clues that the depressed person really uses drugs to sort of elevate his mood. Fatigue or loss of energy, which depressed people don't feel like doing anything at all. That is, there's a loss of energy, there's a physical loss of energy, and which often manifests itself in psychomotor retardation, which is when you stop doing the things that you normally do. You cannot brush your teeth, you don't take a bath, you cannot rise up from bed. So, and a good example of that uh, is in the movie Melancholia, Lars von Trier's movie Melancholia. There's a scene where the person in question is not able to wake up. She's lying in the bed, and they have to force her to essentially wake up and brush her teeth and take a bath, and she's just lying there lifeless. Now that is usually psychomotor retardation. which is, psychomotor retardation is observable by others. It's physical manifestation of depression, as it were, and it usually happens in extreme forms of clinical depression. Suicidal thoughts, obviously, those who are depressed are more likely to be suicidal. They're more likely to think about death. It's not just suicidal thoughts per se, it's also a preoccupation with death as an abstract concept. So depression is treatable by CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or psychotherapy, or meds, depending on the reason. Because when we talk about depression, we often confuse there's often a circular argument going on. That is, we often confuse the symptom with the cause. That is, drug abuse can be either a symptom or a cause. So, for instance, we say that this person, Rohan, has got less grades because he is depressed. Now, I can also say that because Rohan is depressed, he has got less grades. So there's a confusion between symptom and causation in depression that normal people think. And it differs from person to person. That is, for some people, it's seasonal. There's something called seasonal affective disorder, in which you essentially stay depressed for a particular season, a particular month, say 2 months. Every year on July, you're depressed. So that is seasonal affective disorder. For others, it's more genetic. And when it's genetic, it's usually you have to take meds when it's genetic, because there's no other ways of it, Of course, there are going to be side effects and stuff. It happens, but meds do keep you fairly stable. They help you do your normal daily job. So you won't be cutting yourself every movement of every second. And people often do that, when meds and all forms of therapy are used away. What happens is that people with depression, depression is also has a genetic content, it's biologically manifested as well. So there's a surgery in which the anterior cingulate, which is responsible for abstract thoughts, is cut off. In the process is known as cingulotomy. And when that happens, you stop having these compulsive thoughts. You stop cutting yourself off every second, and you're relatively stable. Of course, you also lose your ability to have abstract thoughts, or you have less abstract thoughts, but it's a good trade-off. I mean, you're going to get to leave and stop feeling intense terror every moment of your life, right? So yeah, next slide. Yeah, so I wanted to discuss this with you because I figured out that most of the people who will be listening to this, whether here or on YouTube, are likely to be adolescents, or are likely to know someone who is an adolescent. So what we have noticed, what the data suggests, is that depression, this is one of the causes of depression, by the way. This graph shows that around the year of 2010 and 11, the depression rate for female just went up, while the depression rate for men remained fairly stable. Why did it happen? Next slide. So this is the suicidal rate. Like you can see, the rate for female remains stable till 2009, and up till 2009, there's a spike which goes up. And for men are usually more likely to commit suicide than women. Let me put it different way. Men are more likely to succeed in committing suicide than women. That is, they're more likely to, but women are more likely to have more suicide attempts. Because when men commit suicide, they usually use lethal weapons. They jump off from a building, or they use guns. But when women commit suicide, it's usually through poison, it's usually through sleeping pills, and those methods aren't as effective, of course. So what happened in, next slide. So what happened in 2009, the reason why the rate for female depression went up in 2009 and 2010 is directly connected with the rise of social media. So right around 2010, 9 and to 2015, all of these social media started popping up. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Pinterest, Twitter, uh, all of these deluge of social media started popping up in 2009. And what after 2009, and what it did is, when it comes to depression within men, it's usually because of social reason. But what happens with women is that adolescent women are usually more concerned about their beauty, right? So we have now created, because of these filters, impossible beauty standards, first. Second, we have ensured that the moment you open Instagram, you see these people having happy lives with their partners, or they're roaming around the world, they're clicking great pics and they're enjoying, and it's more likely to someone who is, say, disconnected with them, it's more likely to sort of affect them. And this affects women more than men, because when men want to make someone else feel bad, it's usually through aggression, physical or verbal aggression. But for women, it's more subtle. So in adolescent, if you want to make someone else feel bad, you exclude them from parties. And you make them know that you excluded them from parties through Instagram. You post a picture of party and they were not invited. So, or the beauty standards thing is also elaborated by Facebook and Instagram. So social media has had a very, very crucial effect on the rate of female depression. Um, this has been talked more by Jan Twenge, who is a social psychologist. She has an excellent book on social media called iGen, which I will recommend all of you to check out. It's excellent. So, next slide. Okay, schizophrenia. So schizophrenia, I know that I've said this about depression before, but even more than depression, schizophrenia is completely misunderstood as a disorder, as a disease, because when we think of schizophrenia, we usually just think of hallucination. Well, hallucination is a big part of it, but it's not everything that schizophrenics believes. Schizophrenia is manifested, characterized first by delusions of persecution. Delusions of persecution is essentially when someone with schizophrenia feels that he is being hunted down. Someone is after him, so people are going to kill him, or there's a conspiracy going on to murder him. That is delusion of persecution. Most of you have obviously watched A Beautiful Mind, the biopic of John Nash, who had schizophrenia, and you know, delusion of persecution is a huge part of that movie. Delusions of grandeur, that is schizophrenic, someone with schizophrenia is likely to think very highly of himself or himself, often, not always, because schizophrenia and depression also collide. He's going to think, I'm the king of England, I'm the queen of, I'm Queen Elizabeth, or things like that. Delusions of grandeur, delusions of control. Delusions of control is when I am being controlled by the I'm being controlled by raw. They have attached a chip in my brain, and everything that I'm saying or doing is being controlled by raw. And I want them to stop. That is essentially delusions of control. So these are delusions because there is no logic to them. They're imagined, are perceived. Nothing you can do, no rational argument you can make is going to convince one with schizophrenia that they're not being controlled, they're not being persecuted. Because it has no rationality, it has no logic, it has no reason, right? And that's why it's called delusions. Now, you need to make a distinction between delusions in this sense and delusions when, say, someone has weird beliefs that society does not agree with. Say, flat earthers, for instance. Now, flat earthers do not have delusion in the same way that someone with schizophrenia has delusion, because flat earthers still believe in this sort of logic and evidence and reasoning model, because they still refute the allegations of others. They still have a group surrounding them which tells them that, this is what we believe and what we believe is right. So that is not delusion in the clinical sense of the word. When we are talking about delusion with someone with schizophrenia, we're talking about delusion in a very specific clinical sense. So someone with schizophrenia, nothing you do is going to convince them otherwise. It's completely created. It has no reasoning, which brings us to formal thought disorder. Now, schizophrenia has a lot to do with language, and people don't understand this because uh, it's usually associated with hallucinations and delusion. But formal thought disorder are a very important part of schizophrenia. So a person with schizophrenia is likely to make loose association. Loose association is essentially when, say, what is your favorite color? And my response to that would be, well, I don't like red. Red is a very creepy color, and I had a car which was red. The red car was sold by a person, and I exchanged it for something with black. And now I do like the song "The Lady in Red," though. Right? So that is loose association, and the circumstantial thinking part of it, which is that you talk around circles. You're asked a question and you talk around circles. Which college do you go to? Well, I initially planned to go to Cambridge, but then I decided that I wanted to stay in India.
Hello. Uh, can anybody hear Anwesh? I can't.
No, I can't hear him.
Okay, I think he's logged off or something.
Hello?
Uh,
Hello?
yes, Anwesh.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Can
yeah,
you hear
yeah.
me
Yes,
now?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, I cannot see the screen. What was I talking about?
Um, about formal thought disorder, and then you went off to a tangent from that, I think.
Let me just let the screen come.
I am sharing the screen.
I cannot see the screen. That's the
Maybe I can stop it and start it again.
yeah.
Can you enable it again? I think because you rejoined, it's been disabled. Yes, can you see it? Hello. Hello.
A person with schizophrenia will answer something like, I used to go to uh, a college in abroad, but then I decided that I wanted to study in India. So I was confused about what college I want to study in India. And was confused between government colleges and private colleges. And so now I'm studying at, Delhi University. So this is a very loose connection, talking in circle kind of thing. Neologism, because sometimes what happens is when a schizophrenia talks, you have no idea what the person is saying, because the what the person is saying makes no sense at all. Something like the chair is crying, or the painting is laughing, the walls are talking, things like that, which really uh, grammatically they make sense, but practically they essentially have no meaning at all. Neologisms is they also create new languages, new words, so you have no idea what they mean when they say that. Hallucination, obviously. So there are different kinds of hallucination, and what we usually assume when we think of hallucination is visual hallucination. That is, you see someone who is in front of you and the person is talking to you and you can feel them and touch them, the lage raho munna bhai type of hallucination. But that kind of hallucination is extremely rare. It barely happens when it comes, even in schizophrenia, which is not to say that it does not happen. It does happen, but it's rare. The more likely hallucination, the more common hallucination is auditory hallucinations. So when you listen to people talking with you, and the person and the when the person is talking to you, it could be very polite, could be friendly, but it's usually threatening. The person is ordering you to do things. So that is often seen as a defense in court. Schizophrenics are not likely to commit crime, by the way. We assume that schizophrenics are, because they have these hallucination and delusions, they're likely to commit crime, but they're actually more likely to be victims of crime than to commit crime. But when it does happen, when the voice inside of their head tells them to kill someone, there's a distinction. I think this could be interesting to the lawyers over here might know of this, between compulsion and causation. So say a person with schizophrenia says that, the voice inside my head told me to kill this person, so I killed this person. Now that is causation. That is, the voice inside your head caused you to kill this person. Now, and you can still be convicted of the crime if that is the case. But in compulsion, the voice inside your head is torturing you. Every movement of your life is telling you, with bad, devilish, evil music and choruses in the background, is telling you, go kill him, and is, keeping you in intense terror and intense agony. That is essentially compulsion. That is, you were compelled by the voice to do it. And in that case, you can be uh, treated as not guilty by reason of insanity. Tactile hallucination is when you feel things that aren't there, say, uh, somatoform hallucination and tactile hallucination are when you feel something is crawling inside of you. Say there are worms inside of you, there are worms crawling in your body. I think there's a good Netflix movie called The Gift, which shows the example of tactile hallucination. So auditory hallucination is auditory hallucination is the most common. Tactile hallucination is less common than visual hallucination, but both are also a symptom of schizophrenia. Catatonia. Now, catatonia are essentially postures in which a schizophrenic person assumes a statue-like weird position. We'll see examples of catatonia in the next slides. Negative symptoms are essentially, so these are positive symptoms. Everything that I told you about are positive symptoms. Positive symptoms are things that are added, like hallucination, something that isn't there, it's added, or delusion, you're not deluded before, so all of these are added. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, are something which are taken away from you. So people with schizophrenia are sometimes likely to be non-empathetic. That is, they will not care about others. They're likely to lose their empathy. They're likely to have a blunt effect. Blunt effect is essentially when their face is expressing less and they're not feeling anything what is happening around them, and they're essentially just sitting there like statues. So negative symptoms are essentially things that are taken away from your normal functioning. Positive symptoms are things that are added. So in the next slide, we're going to see the examples of catatonic posturing. Next slide. Yeah, so you can clearly see here examples of catatonic posturing. You might have seen this in movies. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I think there's good examples of this. Plenty of movies which cover schizophrenia. So I think we've come to the end of this conversation. I initially wanted to make this a bit longer, but then I decided that people will not really be interested in hearing me rambling about it for so long. So that's why it was short. But what I do want to end it, I want to say something before ending this as to why it is important to have this sort of surface level knowledge of these things. I think that last year we witnessed a deluge of misinformation on mental health by our so-called journalists. Can you please mute, because I think there's some disturbance. Okay, no, I think it's fine. So last year, we witnessed when a person committed suicide, and he was a Bollywood actor committed suicide, and he was claimed to have been a victim of depression. Journalists jumped over and were talking about, look at his photo, he's smiling, how could he be depressed? To reduce depression, to reduce the suffering that people go through, the intense agony, to a photograph to tell that he's smiling so he cannot be depressed, everything is going good for him so he cannot be depressed. It's a complete misunderstanding of it, and I would not care if it was just misinformation. It's harmful misinformation. It's positively affecting the suffering of millions of people around the world and in this country, who go through this every single day, who go through intense terror and intense agony every single day, who want to die every single day. It's a torture, essentially. So in that case, for us to treat it as something that trivial, for journalists of all people to trivialize it and to give misinformation to public for it, something which is already stigmatized, was absolutely horrible to watch. Which is not to say that I don't want people to talk about mental health disorders. I want everyone to talk about mental health disorders, but please be informed about these topics. These are very important topics. These impact the lives of millions. So you don't have to be a psychologist or a psychology student to talk about this. You can just be a layperson and raise awareness. But as long as you're informed, it doesn't matter. So I think that I have muted everyone now. So what we need to do as human beings, as Indians, I think right now our job when it comes to mental health is to first raise awareness, and second, to have unconditional positive regard. What I see from a lot of people is when they encounter someone who's depressed, who's suffering to mental disorder, they're likely to be very dismissive. But psychologist Carl Rogers had this term, and this is one of the important part. If you want to be a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, you must have unconditional positive regard for your client or your patient. Unconditional positive regard is when you do not judge them. You make an environment where they feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to open up. You understand them no matter how weird, how antisocial, how immoral it sounds for you personally. So you must have unconditional positive regard for those with depression and sympathy. So why can't we just be better human beings? I think I've spoken for long enough. I think it's time for us to open it up for general discussion. I'll stop the recording.